Hello, I am Erin Lashnits, a veterinarian and internal medicine specialist and an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin School of Veterinary Medicine. I'm presenting this course, Zoonotic Disease in Pet Cats, as part of Invisible International's Medical Education Initiative. This program, which includes a large library of free CMEs, is generously supported by the Monte Calvo Family Foundation. Today, I'm going to be talking about zoonotic disease and pet cats. In terms of disclosures, I don't have anything too relevant except for my main disclosure, which is that I'm a veterinarian. I am not a human doctor. And so because of that, this presentation is really for informational and educational purposes and should not be taken as medical advice. So we'll start out with the learning objectives for this presentation. First is we'll talk about some of the common zoonotic diseases that are carried by and transmitted by pet cats. And then the second half will be devoted to diseases that might be imported or moved around during cat adoption, the role of cats in zoonotic disease spillover, and then some steps that people can take to prevent zoonotic disease exposure or introduction from their pet cats. So getting started, we'll talk a little bit about the benefits of cat ownership before getting into all of the downsides. We know that cats can provide emotional support, improve mood, and contribute to the overall morale of their owners. Cats are also credited in some studies with promoting socialization amongst older individuals or physically or mentally handicapped people. So how many people actually own cats? We actually have pretty good numbers on that. Nearly 40 million households in the U.S. have pet cats. And then globally, there are over 370 million cats in homes, and estimates on the order of somewhere over 600 million unowned cats. These numbers are pretty vague because it's a little bit hard to know how many unowned cats there are. So moving into our cat-associated zoonotic diseases. This is a little bit of a summary of the things that I'll talk about. So things hopefully that people already think about and associate with pet cats. And then I'll go into some of the other less likely or less well-known risks as well. The first thing I'll talk about is cat bites. Certainly something that I think about pretty often as a veterinarian working with cats. I do worry about getting bitten, and certainly I worry about my staff getting bitten as well. Cat bites are a big problem. They're second to dog bites in terms of incidence in the U.S. And worldwide, it kind of ranges, but maybe up to half of injuries from animal bites in some places. The interesting thing about cat bites is while they're less common than dog bites, they're more likely to get infected. And so in the U.S., it's thought that cat bites are responsible for about 3/4 of animal bites that result in an infection. Some numbers to put on that. So every year in the U.S., there's about 400,000 cat bites. And of those, about 66,000 visits to the ER for the cat bites. What do cat bites look like? So these are some pictures I just pulled off of a couple of recent case reports of cat bite wounds. These bite wounds tend to have sort of deep-seated infection, and they have a rapid progression. So there's cellulitis, lymphangitis, and this can happen even up like within 24 hours. I think this is very unsurprising to me. I've seen this happen from my own coworkers, fortunately never from myself. But, we know that this is a big risk. And so if somebody does get bit, it's like, stop everything you're doing, go wash up and get yourself to the doctor because you have to get that taken care of because it will get infected. In terms of those treatments, early wound cleaning, like doing that hand washing, and then prophylactic antibiotics. If it is more deep-seated or longer term, sometimes surgical debridement can be necessary. So that was the case report in that lower picture that needed to be debrided for some of that like necrotic material. So these can be pretty nasty. Definitely not something that you want to get. Moving on from bites to a zoonotic disease associated with cats is probably one of the top things that people think about when they think about infectious diseases of cats, and that's toxoplasmosis. So toxo in people, we know this is a multisystemic disease. It causes granulomatous inflammation in many organ systems. And it's also more of a concern in certain at-risk populations, including immunocompromised people, and then pregnant people who have not been previously infected. And that's because the abortion or fetal abnormalities that can be associated with toxo infection are really more likely with your first toxo infection. So if you're seronegative, you're more at risk. In terms of the transmission for toxo, cats are the reservoir host. Toxo lives in the cat GI tract, and the oocysts are shed in feces. The important thing to remember about the toxo life cycle is that the oocysts that are shed in the feces have to sporulate before they become infectious. That sporulation takes anywhere from 1 to 5 days after they're defecated out. And so this is important for exposure risk because people are infected by ingesting sporulated oocysts, not the sort of freshly defecated out ones. And so that only presents a risk after they sporulate, after that sort of 1 to 5 day window. People can also be infected by ingesting a different life stage of the toxo organism, which is called a bradyzoite. That's the life stage that makes the cysts in tissue. So this is how you might get infected if you eat like undercooked meat from an infected animal. In terms of risk factors for toxo, certainly cat ownership is something that I think everyone thinks about, but there are other ones, and this has been interestingly looked at in some surveys of OBGYNs over the years. So I think one big take-home point that I got from reading some of this literature is that the risk currently, I think, is a little bit overestimated. So back in the 90s, they surveyed OB-GYNs, and about 80% of them had seen a case of acute toxo within the past year. It was pretty common, apparently, back then. 80% of them had seen a case. Repeating the survey in 2012, so now 10 years ago, over 90% of OB-GYNs surveyed had not seen a case of acute toxo within the past year. So that prevalence and incidence seems to have really decreased over time. What about the cat risk factors? So this survey study showed that almost every OB-GYN asked patients about changing the cat litter. Like, this is a known risk factor. But only about half of them asked about the frequency of changing the cat litter. And you'll remember this is important because toxo doesn't become infectious until that feces has been sitting for at least a day. So if you change the litter box every day, you can virtually eliminate the potential for toxo transmission by that route, by that cat route. If you can eliminate the transmission by that route, then what are the other potential risks? So other sources could actually be more important now. Toxo oocysts can survive in soil for over a year, and of course then can contaminate anything that comes into contact with that soil. So hands, fruits, vegetables, water sources. And so thinking about not just your undercooked meats, but potentially your unwashed vegetables, your unsanitized water sources, your other soil exposures like gardening. I think a lot of people think about sandboxes. Like, I see a sandbox and I see a giant cat litter box. But other people don't think so much about other soil exposure as a potential risk. So I think that some of these risk factors are important to think about when you're screening these at-risk populations. All right, moving on from toxo to our flea and tick-borne diseases. So there is, I think, a common misconception that cats have less flea and tick infestation than dogs. Happily, there's been some literature on this that seems to counteract this perception. This study came out a few years ago, looked at free-roaming cats in Oklahoma. So free-roaming cats meaning unowned cats, stray or feral cats that are not living in people's houses. And they looked at over 600 cats and all the ectoparasites, so all the fleas, ticks, lice, whatever they found on these cats. They found that over 70% of these cats had fleas, and they could find those fleas year-round. They also found that about 20% of those cats had ticks. They also found ticks year-round, although more commonly in the spring and summer than in the winter. The ticks they found were, as you might expect for this area of the country, mostly Amblyomma americanum, the Lone Star tick, but they did find some Ixodes scapularis and dermacenter ticks, which is similar to what you might expect for dogs or people. Another survey study that just recently came out of the UK looked at a different population of cats. This was owned cats that were coming to their vets for care, so not these sort of feral stray cats. They looked just for fleas in these cats coming into the vet, looked at over 800 cats. And what they found was that 28% of those cats had fleas. This was doing a specific combing to see if they could find any fleas on the cats. Interestingly, they had dogs in this study too, and they found that only 14% of the dogs in that same study had fleas. So at least in the UK, the cats were about twice as likely as the dogs to have fleas when you really looked hard for them. There have been a couple of sort of national surveys in the US. This graphic shows the results from a study looking at the medical records from one big national corporate practice of veterinarians. And it shows the percentage of cats that somebody had written down in their medical record that they had fleas. We know this is underreporting, right? We might not be looking for fleas in every cat if they're here for something else, if they don't have any clinical signs, if we just don't have time to spend 5 minutes combing a cat. And then even if we find them, we might not always write it down. And so, if a cat is there because it fell out of a high rise, you might not be as worried about its fleas because you're worried about other more critical problems. So this is probably an underreporting, but even still, up to 20% of cats had fleas noted in their medical records. And you can see the geographic distribution of this. It's not uniform across the US. So cats get fleas. Definitely do. What are the zoonotic disease risks here? There are a handful of bacterial diseases that are associated with cat fleas. This is Bartonella, plague, and probably some of the flea-borne rickettsia organisms. No viral diseases associated with fleas, at least as of yet. It's also important to remember that fleas bite, and that can cause flea bite allergy, flea bite dermatitis, and can be uncomfortable both for the cats and the people. So we'll go a little bit into the life cycle of a flea, just because I think it helps to understand how fleas feed and what they do in terms of their pathogen transmission risk. This YouTube playlist actually has a lot more detail here, but if you've never seen a flea crawling on a cat or dog, that's great. I hope you never do. But this is what it looks like. Sometimes they're stationary, they're feeding, but sometimes they're kind of crawling around in place. This is a still of a flea that is feeding and defecating. So the flea is a blood-feeding parasite. It takes up blood from the host, and then it takes up way more blood than it can digest. And so what it defecates out is actually basically cat blood or host blood of whatever it's feeding on. That dries up and becomes what we call flea dirt. So if you've ever seen an animal with a flea infestation, you'll recognize this little sort of black specks. And if you use a moist paper towel to tap those black specks, you can see that it's actually red because it's really dried blood that the flea has defecated out. This is a picture of a flea depositing eggs. And flea eggs, they basically produce eggs all the time after they've fed, and they're very small, but they can be seen with the naked eye. So that is a picture of some flea eggs on somebody's finger. The eggs, interestingly, do not stay on the animal. They actually fall off and onto the floor, into the carpet, into the bedding, wherever. And then they hatch into larvae. The larvae feed on the mother flea's feces. That's their blood meal that allows them to molt into adults. So with that little review, it becomes really important because this helps us understand how some of our flea-borne diseases are transmitted. And so probably our most commonly known flea-borne disease of cats is Bartonella. If you've heard of more than one flea-borne disease of cats, you've probably heard of toxo, but maybe you've also heard of cat scratch disease. So cats are the reservoir hosts for multiple different species of Bartonella. Bartonella henselae is certainly the best studied of these. And the sort of typical agent that we think of causing cat scratch disease. The biggest risk factor at this point for transmission is probably fleas, and that gets to the transmission cycle. So this graphic here shows the transmission of Bartonella henselae amongst cats and fleas and into people and dogs. So you can see here, if you start with the cat that has a Bartonella henselae infection, they are the reservoir host. They are often asymptomatic, but not always, and they can have chronic long-standing infections. This usually doesn't present a problem until and unless they have a flea infestation, at which point the flea feeds on that infected blood, and then as it feeds, it defecates out that digested blood. That digested blood is also infected with Bartonella, and that flea feces, the flea dirt, can remain infectious with Bartonella in the environment for up to 10 or 11 days. And so that infected flea feces actually becomes the infectious material that then gets inoculated in through the skin with the cat scratch or, cat bite, or maybe even somebody scratching a flea bite that they get, any kind of inoculation through the skin. And in experimental studies they've done looking at transmission of Bartonella from cat to cat, there's no evidence that Bartonella can transmit in the absence of fleas. And so experimental studies obviously haven't been done with transmission to people, but the assumption is that in the absence of fleas, the risk is pretty low because this is an organism that's in the bloodstream of the cat, and otherwise you would need sort of blood-blood contact with your cat, which is less likely unless there is a flea infestation. So moving on to another flea-borne disease that people have definitely heard of, and that is plague. You may not associate plague with cats, but cats are highly susceptible to plague. And every few years, there's a report of people being exposed from a cat in the endemic areas of the U.S. Cats can transmit plague to people both directly and via infected fleas. So it's definitely something to keep on your radar if you're in an area that has plague. So what are these areas? This is a map from the CDC showing each red dot is one reported case of plague, and this is since 1970. You can see it's really localized to the sort of Four Corners region through the west, in California and Oregon. Interestingly, if you had looked at this map maybe 5 years ago, you really wouldn't have seen any of these dots east of the Mississippi, and I'm honestly not entirely sure what to make of that. I would assume these are travel-associated cases, but I wasn't able to find that information really easily, so it's definitely something to think about. And certainly, the range does maybe seem to be expanding a little bit. Like if you looked at this, it was really concentrated in the Four Corners. So it's something to definitely keep an eye on and think about. Also important to remember that, yes, plague is endemic in the U.S. Every year there are cases, and every few years there are deaths. This goes up to 2020, but there was probably one death in 2021 as well. So then our final flea-borne disease associated with cats is our flea-borne rickettsia infections. These cause sort of an acute febrile illness. It can be difficult to differentiate from any other acute febrile illness. And there's two species of rickettsia that we mostly think about in these cases. So rickettsia typhi, that's the agent of murine typhus. And then rickettsia felis, which is a much more newly discovered rickettsial organism. It's the agent of flea-borne spotted fever. Murine typhus, known about for a long time, generally endemic to tropical, subtropical areas, and the transmission cycle is between rats and rat fleas. However, there has been a reemergence of rickettsia typhi in two locations in the U.S., in Southern California and Texas, since the 2000s. And the proposed transmission cycle is between possums and cat fleas. The role for cats in that transmission cycle really is unclear. And so we just don't know how much cats might be serving as a source of infection in those cases. For rickettsia felis, because it is more newly discovered, just a lot less is known about it. It's been reported worldwide. It has sort of an unknown pathogenicity. It's a little bit controversial how much or how severe of disease this organism causes. And the reservoir is an unknown. A few have been proposed, but nothing really seems to stick. It is suspected to have the cat flea as a vector, and that's mainly because when you look at cat fleas, you can find rickettsia felis in a lot of them. But the role of the cat in this cycle is, again, pretty unclear. It's certainly not that every cat has rickettsia felis infection. So we don't know if cats are the reservoir or if they're just getting incidentally infected like people or dogs or any other species. Important things to remember about, rickettsial organisms in general, but flea-borne rickettsia specifically, is that the diagnosis is often not achieved until after people seroconvert, because this is an acute illness. And so it's important to think about these diseases early and treat empirically if you suspect them. Usually there's a pretty good rapid response to doxycycline. All right, so now we'll move on to ticks and cats. A lot of stuff on fleas, less on ticks. Some people think that cats don't get ticks, and this is just wrong. Cats definitely get ticks. They get ticks in very similar ways to dogs get ticks. if you're looking for a tick on a cat, you probably want to look at the head, the neck, basically the places where it can't groom the tick off. And they get similar ticks to what dogs and people get, ixodes, amblyoma, depending on what part of the country you're in. There is one paper that looked at across the country what ticks are infesting cats. So this looked at all the ticks that were removed from cats brought into the vet across a year-long period. They found that over 300 cats had ticks and sort of this distribution of different types. On average, cats had 2 or 3 ticks, and so it wasn't huge burdens of ticks, except for a few unlucky ones like the one that went up to 46. That's really rough. Another interesting finding from this study was that over 20% of the cats with ticks lived mainly or entirely indoors. And so that is just an important thing to think about because indoor cats can get ticks too. And this is something that I use when I talk to clients about, the risk of cats getting ticks and as a reason to keep your even indoor cat on a tick preventative year round. What about the zoonotic diseases associated with ticks? Similar to dogs, you might get a tick that rides in on your cat. So the tick hops on your cat outside and hops off and hops on you once it gets inside. But generally, you're not getting the tick-borne disease from your cat. Rather, you're having a similar exposure to what your cat is having. So your cat doesn't give you the Lyme, but rather your cat and you both go outside into your yard where there are a lot of ticks with Lyme and you get exposed to those same ticks. So it's not a true zoonosis from your cat per se. Okay, so then we're going to move on to worms. Very exciting topic. A lot of people wonder whether they can get worms from their cat. And so I'm going to go through some of the common GI parasites of our pet cats. First, we'll talk about roundworms. Roundworms are certainly a common cat parasite. These are some pictures of them, the adults. Roundworms have transplacental transmission in cats, and so they are very common in kittens. Often you won't see any symptoms, particularly in healthy adult cats. They can clear them. Kittens are more likely to have symptoms, and if you see symptoms, it's going to be diarrhea, dehydration, that pot-bellied appearance, that kind of thing. And with really significant worm burdens, you actually can see cats vomit or defecate out the adult worms. So I think this picture up on the top here is probably a rinsed off cat vomitus, including some of the roundworms that cat had. In terms of human disease, Toxocara causes ocular and visceral and maybe neural larval migrans. And then people get infected by ingesting eggs that are passed in feces. An important thing to remember about Toxocara eggs, unlike toxo, is that the eggs fresh from the feces are infectious. They don't have to undergo that day-long sporulation process. So you can get exposed from cleaning the litter box every day if your cat has Toxocara. We also think that Toxocara cati, the cat version of roundworms, might actually play a larger role in human toxocariasis in the U.S. than maybe is thought. People think it's the dog roundworm, but actually Toxocara cati in some studies was the second most common nematode in dogs and cats after hookworms. So it might be a more important source of toxocariasis in people than the dog version. Next parasite I'll talk about is hookworms. Hookworms are similar species in dogs and cats. They are particularly common in the southeast. Again, cats can be minimally symptomatic. Generally, healthy adult cats will not show signs, but the infections can be severe and even fatal, and particularly in young kittens. And you'll see weight loss, diarrhea, sometimes electrolyte abnormalities, and then anemia. Transmission occurs when larvae are actually passed in the cat feces, and then people get exposed when they have skin contact with those larvae. So this is what causes cutaneous larval migrans. Apparently, rarely, if you ingest the larva, it can lead to an eosinophilic enteritis as well. Tapeworms. Cats do get tapeworms. These are some pictures I found online of cats and their owners and their tapeworms. The cats get the same tapeworm as dogs get. So this is Diploidium caninum. People don't get this tapeworm from cats directly, but they can get infected if they accidentally ingest an infected flea. And so this top picture here where this person is pointing to the dried out tapeworm segments that the cat passed, they don't have to worry about getting a tapeworm if they accidentally touch one of those segments, although I wouldn't put my finger that close to them. The bottom picture here just shows what those proglottids, those segments look like in the intestine. This is a postmortem picture, of course. But once they dry out, they turn into those little sesame seed-like proglottids. So they just look a little different before they dry out and die. So the fact that this is passed by fleas is another really important reason to keep cats on flea preventative year-round, so that they don't, you clear their tapeworm infection with good deworming, but you can prevent it from coming back using flea preventatives. So then moving on to some things that are called worms, but are definitely not actually worms. So the first one would be ringworm. Ringworm is actually a fungal skin disease, generally microsporum species in cats. And so this is just a picture of some of the manifestations that you might see it with a cat with ringworm. Sometimes it's really minimal and pretty subtle, like a little alopecia on a toe. Sometimes it's more widespread, like this little black kitten. And sometimes it can get secondary infection or just irritation from scratching, like the more redness that you can see on the white cat on the right. These kind of are these typical lesions, and generally you're going to see those lesions in small kittens and then cats in high stress environments, particularly in the shelter. Transmission occurs just from skin contact. It can also occur from fomites, so contaminated bedding, anything like that. And studies have shown that probably about half of people in households or with contact with infected cats will develop lesions of ringworm from infected cats. So you can see in this picture, the person holding the black kitten is happily wearing gloves. The person on the right holding the white kitten is not wearing gloves. And so they probably have a 50-50 shot if they're going to get ringworm or not. Moving on to other parasites, our GI protozoa, again, not worms, but considered sort of our GI parasites. This is Giardia cryptosporidium. The thing that we were taught in vet school was people get Giardia from people. Generally, molecular phylogenetic tools have shown that the genotypes of Giardia that commonly infect cats don't commonly infect people, and so zoonotic infection is rare, but it is possible in people with immunodeficiencies like AIDS. This is similar for cryptosporidium. Crypto is just rare in cats, and if they do get infected, it's typically with a cat-specific species, Cryptosporidium felis. So it's possible for people to get that one. It's just very uncommon. To summarize our worm question, what worms or GI parasites do I worry about? Certainly rounds and hooks, and those are the ones I recommend deworming all your kittens and regularly deworming your adult cats for. I also do worry about ringworm. Certainly in kittens, any cats with dermatologic lesions, and cats in the shelter. I've definitely seen lots of cats in shelters with ringworm, and I think most of the people that have worked with them have been exposed one way or another. Things I'm less likely to worry about would be tapeworms and things like Giardia and crypto, just less likely zoonotic spread. So some of our final zoonotic diseases that I'll talk about are just the ones that are less common or less likely to pose a risk. One thing not to forget about in cats is our food-borne pathogens. We might think about this more in dogs, but certainly food-borne pathogens can be associated with raw diets, and some cats do eat raw food. It's something I recommend against because of the potential for salmonella, E. coli, all those kinds of things. And the FDA does put out diet recalls on veterinary products as well. And so this is something to think about if you have, this is why we recommend not feeding raw food. Sporotrichosis is a zoonotic disease that I hadn't really learned much about until fairly recently. So the genus Sporothrix is typically non-pathogenic environmental fungi, but there are some members of the Sporothrix schenkii complex that are pathogens. And they are pathogens both for cats and for people. So the sort of typical transmission that has been described is traumatic inoculation of contaminated soil or plant material that contains this fungus through skin or mucous membranes. But there now are reports of this alternative transmission where people have Sporothrix inoculated from a scratch or a bite from an infected cat. This graphic here just shows a recent study looking at the distribution of sporotrichosis around the world and how often cats are associated with the transmission. You can see that it does happen in the US. And then here, this picture, sorry, it's a little bit gross, shows, I think, but I think it illustrates really nicely that cats and people get very similar lesions. Cats often have lesions on their face, but they can then inoculate the Sporotrichs into a person and cause infection that way. It is treatable in cats, and so it's definitely something to not, you don't need to put your cat to sleep. You can treat it and they can get better. And again, limit the risk for zoonotic transmission. Cats and COVID, we heard a lot about this probably throughout the past few years, thinking about the role that cats might play in COVID transmission. Cats are susceptible to COVID. If they do have clinical signs, usually those symptoms are pretty mild. We know that human to cat transmission of SARS-CoV-2 is fairly common in households. So studies suggest anywhere up to maybe 60 or 65% of cats in infected households are infected or seroconvert. And they've shown that cats that sleep in bed with owners is a risk factor, which makes sense for a respiratory pathogen. We also know that cat-to-cat transmission is possible, and this has been shown experimentally and also in zoos with big cats. In household settings, it's been a little harder to study, but this probably is happening. And the R0, at least from the experimental studies, is estimated to be greater than 1. Cat-to-human transmission, we know a little bit less about. It may be possible, but it's probably not a huge problem. Human-to-human transmission is so efficient that the cat-to-human transmission is probably playing less of a role. And then cats serving as a reservoir also seems fairly unlikely. They have a pretty short shedding period, and we know that people serving as their own reservoir is happening plenty fine without cats contributing. So the bottom line would be to avoid the small, but probably not entirely zero health risk posed by reducing cats' contact with infected people. Finally, just a handful of other fairly uncommon cat-associated zoonotic diseases. Cowpox, definitely more a problem in the UK. The UK estimates that about half of human cowpox cases are actually due to transmission from cats, not cows. This is spread by scratches or bites. There have been reports of avian influenza transmitting from cats to people. This was during an outbreak, maybe 10 or 15 years ago now in New York, and probably associated with these like high-density cat shelters where a lot of infected cats were sneezing on the workers. There are a handful of pathogens that we just don't quite know the role that cats are playing. Q fever is one of them. There have been reports that Coxiella burnetii is in the fluid and tissue associated with cat births. Fortunately, people are usually not around the cat births, and so the risk is probably minimal from that perspective. And then lepto. Cats do shed lepto in their urine. We just don't know what role they're playing in sort of the burden of disease in people compared to other wildlife hosts, dogs, cows, anybody else. So, this is going to start into the sort of second half of our talk today. And I'm going to talk about some of the risks and potential solutions for thinking about cat adoption and relocation. We don't know actually a lot about the sort of international cat trade. We certainly know less about this for cats than we do about dogs. But we have found there are Facebook posts, there are websites where you can get cats for sale, you can buy them internationally, you can adopt them internationally. And so it does raise concern for this being sort of an understudied problem. So to remind you of the scope of the problem, estimates suggest that there is over 600 million unowned cats worldwide. These cats live and exist on this sort of spectrum of lifestyles, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in the next slide. But there's basically a super complicated interplay of various factors that combine to influence the health and welfare of the cat populations, as well as the health and welfare of the human populations that they interact with. So in a lot of cases, there are people or organizations that are looking for ways to improve these cats' lives and presumably improve the community's lives too, and do that by placing these unowned cats into homes. But relocating and homing these cats is not always as straightforward as just taking them and popping them with an owner. There's lots of different influences and sort of implications on this process. And so Some of these would include things like the economic and cultural roles that cats play in different communities, making sure to understand those. The environmental and public health effects of unowned cats, both for the cats as well as sort of the wildlife and other animal communities in those areas and the human communities in those areas. And then, of course, the welfare of the cats and potentially the welfare of their new owners that they're going to be living with. So I mentioned that globally, unowned cats live and exist on this spectrum of lifestyles, and I think this graphic illustrates that really nicely. This shows kind of the spectrum of cats from, pet cat lives in your house through feral cat really doesn't interact with people. And cats from all of these categories can be found up for adoption. The thing that's really important to remember is not that you can't adopt out all of these cats, but that we have to make sure that the needs of each individual cat are being met in the household or home situation that they're going to. That will help protect the cat. Like, we don't want to stress the cats out or make them live in ways that they don't want to live, but also it will help protect the human members of the household. And this is particularly true for the feral cats or the street cats. These are the cats that really are not socialized to people and often find people threatening, become distressed when they're confined in homes. These are the cats that probably pose the most risk for bites, for scratches. And the interesting thing is that we actually don't know where on the spectrum the most risk for zoonotic disease lies or zoonotic disease exposure. But certainly cats that are more likely to bite or scratch are going to be the ones that are more likely to transmit any of those pathogens that they have. So there are worldwide attempts to place these unowned cats into homes, but we don't really know how often this is occurring across borders. So certainly in the US, most cat owners adopt their cats from shelters, and often this is done fairly locally. But there's really no data on how commonly cats are imported to the US. The UK, they actually do have data on this, and so this can give us a clue that it is occurring. They do an annual survey of cat ownership every year, and so from 2020 through 2022, they found that across the country, between 70 and 85,000 cats were imported each year. So that's, not a lot of cats in the spectrum of 600 million, but it's certainly happening. And because it is certainly happening, we do have to think about some of these risks. So, of course, importing disease is one risk that we run with importing cats. This is important from the perspective of the importers, the people that are working with these cats, and the potential adopters of the cats. We don't want them to be exposed to zoonotic disease. And this is, of course, particularly a problem with rabies. Rabies affects cats similar to dogs. I went into a lot more detail about rabies in the dog CME, the dog zoonotic disease CME, but I'll just give you a couple of links here. This is the CDC information on rabies, particularly rabies internationally. And of course, cats can get rabies. They can transmit rabies to people, and they should be vaccinated for rabies before being adopted. So something to look into if you do come across the international cat adoption situation. This is also an interesting website. It's just a little sort of test yourself quiz about the risk of rabies in various situations. So in addition to the sort of importing disease, zoonotic disease component, we know that globalization and global travel leads to similar risk for cat populations when they're doing it, as it does for human populations. And this, I think, is also important domestically as well, because different diseases do have different geographic distributions. And so even if it's not across national borders, we do have to be cognizant of the fact that we don't want to be moving cats and moving their pathogens around and importing disease, even state to state. This is important both for cat-specific diseases, but also for zoonotic diseases. So in terms of the cat-specific diseases, there are a lot of these pathogens that are cat-specific. They don't cause disease in people, but they are easily transmitted cat to cat and have really important geographical differences. And this is something that I think underlies the recommendation for cats to be checked out by vets and go through sort of a battery of tests before they're adopted, especially adopted into homes with other cats, because we don't want to be transmitting these pathogens cat to cat. There's also, of course, zoonotic diseases that we have to worry about importing to non-endemic areas. Things that I think about would be Leishmaniasis and Chagas disease, and this is similar for dogs, but cats are susceptible to both of these as well. The relocation of vectors is another issue that I think we have to be aware of. I think there's probably a slightly increased risk of moving vectors with cats, even compared to dogs, because it's harder to find fleas and ticks on cats. Like, we're not always doing a really thorough search. And especially for some of the scared cats that are coming in off the streets, like, it's hard to even touch them at all, much less search them thoroughly for fleas and ticks. And in addition to that, people just think that cats are less likely to have particularly ticks than dogs are. So to avoid relocating the vectors, happily, we can easily treat for fleas and ticks first, get rid of those infestations, and then not have to worry about doing a full body search on a cat. I think this is also all important for the role that cats play in zoonotic disease spillover. So we think about this again with dogs and other companion animals, but cats, I think, have this really interesting role where, especially outdoor cats, like, they go out into the world, they go out into nature, they interact with other cats, they interact with a lot of small wildlife, and then they come home and they interact with us and they sleep in our beds. And so they may be playing a really important role as a bridge species for some of these zoonotic spillovers. And it's just a really understudied situation because these cats, especially the unowned cats or the outdoor cats, they often aren't the ones that have lots of vet care. And they're not the ones that are easy to study. So one other important role that I think we have to think about for cats as well as dogs is cats as sentinels of disease. Again, we don't think about this that much for cats, but we can use cats as sentinels. They're out there in the environment. They're exposed to a lot of the diseases that people are too. There's one good example of this, which is cryptococcus infection. So cats are susceptible to crypto, and they get clinical disease, and so they can act as sentinels for environmental contamination and therefore a risk of human exposure. This map here shows the human cases versus the animal cases of crypto from this outbreak in the Pacific Northwest. And you can see they really do cluster together. So I think this is a reasonable thing to think about for cats too. I wanted to leave you with a few resources here. These websites all have slightly different focuses and slightly different information. These last two are European references, but all of these are focused on parasites or zoonotic diseases of cats and dogs. And I think they actually have really good information on specifically zoonotic diseases associated with cats. And maybe even better information than some of the human resources, because there's a tendency to think of cats as little dogs, and they're really not. They have different, very different, lifestyles, disease exposures, disease risks. And so all of these websites would be good places to look into if you're looking specifically for information about cat-associated zoonoses. So finally, to wrap up, let's talk about some of the things we can do. How can we start to mitigate these risks? The UK has actually proposed a protocol for assessing imported cats very recently. And I think just to kind of summarize this quickly, but the US could do well to think about putting in place some of these guidelines, not just for importing cats across borders either. I think this is really important for thinking about rehoming cats from sort of like out in the wild, out in a free roaming situation into someone's home where they're going to be, living with people. So assessing their temperament, doing a full health screening, particularly looking for parasites, looking for these feline retroviruses that can predispose them to a lot of worse diseases, doing some basic blood work, a chem panel, a CBC, looking for any evidence for underlying disease. Neutering and identifying with microchips is important too. And then finally, treating any of the minor medical issues that they find. And in the UK, they proposed treating for ticks and tapeworms, and I would expand that to fleas and ticks and all GI parasites, because I don't think we can be so naive as to think that our cats aren't susceptible to these things too. We know that cats are probably twice as likely as dogs to have fleas. So some recommendations for bringing a new cat into the home. Certainly think about the pathogens that can be shared between cats, whether these are zoonotic or just cat diseases. And that really underlies the recommendation for a quarantine period for new cats, letting them acclimate to the home, as well as not spread any of those pathogens that they might be exposed to in the shelter environment or anything like that. And then keeping stress minimal is also really important when introducing a new cat. So we know that some of the pathogens can have worse manifestations in high stress environments. And this is things like FIP, things like the upper respiratory pathogens, and even things like ringworm. And then finally, making sure that this good, thorough preventative care has been done before you bring the cat home, I think is really important. There are really good flea and tick preventatives. There's really good deworming. All the cats should be vaccinated against rabies before interacting with anyone in the home. And all of these things can and should be done before bringing them home, just so that they don't put anyone in the household at risk. Finally, the CDC has some nice guidelines on how to sort of safely interact with all kinds of pets, and this crosses species too. But some things to think about would be, adult supervision, not letting kids interact with cats. Without supervision, it just increases the risk for scratches and bites. Good hand washing practice, of course, important, particularly surrounding the litter box. Something that is really kind of important for cats is to remember that hands are not toys. So one of the things that people like to do is like play with little kittens using their hands as toys. And I think that this really sort of teaches cats that like the play biting and play scratching is okay to do. A cat doesn't have to want to hurt you. It can, those play bites and scratches still break the skin, even if they don't, if they mean to be playing. So definitely using toys instead of hands to discourage that play biting and play scratching, I think is really important to prevent some of that disease transmission risk. Then, of course, your regular vet care, using flea and tick prevention all year round, using deworming regularly, whether that's an annual dewormer or a lot of the heartworm preventatives also have effects against intestinal parasites. And that's what I use for my cat. He gets dewormed every month with his heartworm preventative. And then, of course, thinking about your annual fecals and whether you need to do that more frequently for, little kittens or cats with GI signs. Avoiding raw food can definitely limit the risk for things like E. coli and salmonella. And then good litter box management. So cleaning daily can virtually eliminate the risk of toxo exposure. And then making sure you're disposing the litter and the feces in the trash and not using it as compost or fertilizer or putting it out into the environment, because that can put both toxo and roundworms out into the environment if your cat is shedding them. All right, so wrapping up, we know that there are a large number of unowned cats, and that continues to constitute an animal welfare issue and then ecological and sort of societal and public health problems. We can combat this by relocating and placing these cats in homes, but we run into problems if we don't understand an individual cat's lifestyle, disease status, exposure risks, and that can lead to stress on the cats as well as stress on the owners. It can also lead to movement or spread of cat-specific pathogens and increased risk of exposure to zoonotic pathogens. Happily, to mitigate these risks, we can. We just have to understand the cat's previous and preferred lifestyle, and probably do more research to understand how those lifestyles influence exposure to and transmission of these zoonotic pathogens, also the geographic distribution of these pathogens. We can still adopt these cats, right? It is a good thing to adopt a cat. We just have to do it with good practices. And so that includes things like appropriate testing and medical and preventative care. And that is for cats within the US or from abroad. I think with the right preparation and the right medical attention, the right veterinary care, we can really appropriately place all of these cats into happy homes. And that improves not only the cat's quality of life, but as I started out with, the owner's quality of life too. And with that, I will close. These are some references. There are more references scattered throughout as well. And here's my contact information if anyone has any further questions or just wants to talk about cats and zoonoses.